Bonjour, and then we magani to kubana kwitnigo. Pajugo sha and do them. Quick kibit ask I'll be tongue meno dish in the cars. Pajugo meno and the kitten do them. Kagi what the so nigga mingin do je. Abache and G can dum pija ya no ma Blackfoot sugodash meno ane ya king sugodash menoa ki bugetin in the nim. Puanak Nakoda Ishnakazoat Higuete Bakan and Ishnabik. Kimami got you in Wanish Pijay at the marking. Nongum Abajenji Kandam Kinonde Windamawan and him Anish Wenji Minopimatiziat Kate Anishinabik Shigodash in Dan Kobitaganak. How Missigo Minik and Dinaway Maganak Miigwach indicate. Or as we like to say in English, hey, what's up? Yeah, the laugh was for the joke, and then the round of applause was, all right, he speaks English, good. It's going to be a long talk for a while there. I always like to start in the language that I grew up around, which is Ojibwe, because it is the way that we were taught to introduce ourselves by our parents, our grandparents, and our elders. But I also like to begin in Ojibwe because between the 1600s and the 1800s, Ojibwe was known as the lingua franca of what is now Canada, meaning it was the business language of the area in North America between the St. Lawrence and the Red River, right? And so if you came here during that time, 17th century to 19th century, you didn't necessarily need to know how to speak French. You didn't necessarily need to know how to speak English. You needed to know how to speak an indigenous language in order to be successful in business in this part of the world. And yet, how many of us learned that in school? Right? How many of us are cognizant of that? Right? Instead, we're taught this myth of two founding nations. Well, in reality, there's about 60 plus founding nations in this country. And so that's a little bit of what I would like to talk to you guys about today. So I'd also like to say, how mitakiape, tashunka luta wakate amacheapelo. And also, wabi kihu, etisnahason, tanse. So I got 3 indigenous languages down, about 60 more to go. Hopefully you guys bear with me. So what I said in my introduction there is that my name is Wabana Kwitkwikwe Kibenasozawa Bitang Kinew. It's not a joke, so don't laugh. Just kidding. Go ahead, you can try it out, try it on for size. It means gray cloud, a thunderbird that's turning in mid-flight, sitting on the earth, the yellow earth, and eagle. Those are what my names mean, taken together. And then the second thing that I say in my introduction, and that we always say as Anishinabek, because we're people of the clan, is that I'm a member of the Lynx family, the Lynx clan. And this is how we tracked our families since time immemorial. So if you would have met my great-great-grandparents, they wouldn't have had a last name. They would have just had their given names and then a clan animal. And that's how they track their family. And clans are very important to this day in our nation because they tell you who you can and can't date. Very important. Sometimes there's this idea that indigenous culture is something trapped in the past, in a museum somewhere, and it's not really alive today, but that's not true. Even the clan system, for instance, is very much relevant to us today. A few years ago, well, I'm getting older, so almost like 10 years ago now, I was hanging out with this young woman, and it was going really well. We were hitting it off, and then as we were walking there together, she turns to me and she said, "So, what's your clan?" And they're laughing because that's a pickup line in some indigenous communities, right? "Hey, what's your clan?" Right? So she asked me that, right? "What's your clan?" And I was like, "Well, I'm a lynx, you know." It's like Ojibwe innuendo. Right? Then she's like, "Oh wow, I'm a lynx too." And I was like, "Okay, see you later." So yeah, culture's still alive in some funny and kind of contemporary ways. The third thing that I say is that I grew up here in a place called Raven's Nest Portage, Kakagiwatesonigaming. This is on the Lake of the Woods side of the portage, and took this photo like 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning this past summer when my son and I went out to pull some nets on Lake of the Woods. And it just gives you an idea of how beautiful our traditional territory, as with many territories across Canada, can be. And so this was the image that I had of my people growing up, is that we lived in a beautiful part of the world. We were very strong and proud. We were hardworking. We were early to rise. We were industrious. We were fun-loving. We liked to laugh. We liked to share. And then when I was a little kid, I left the reserve and moved to Winnipeg to go to school. And I realized that there's another view of my people in this country today. And it took me a long time to reconcile that. And in fact, I'm still trying to sort through what all that means. But I thought I would take you to Lake of the Woods country, Treaty 3 territory. And also in Ojibwe, I acknowledge the territory of the indigenous nations on whose land we are now. I also acknowledge the people of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, whom we are guests of here in Alberta. But for now, I wanted to travel to Treaty 3 and to tell you a little bit about how it is that we grow up learning. What is the traditional education of an Anishinaabe, of a little indigenous person in our community? Well, it starts from a young age when you're in a cradle board and you hear the lullabies and the traditional songs of your people as you are put to sleep. It continues as you hear the language, as you see the ceremonies, as you are brought into the powwow circle, as you listen to the elders in the wintertime telling you the stories and the legends and the traditions of our people. It's a very beautiful way of life, and it's a very beautiful way to learn about the world around you. And so I thought that I would maybe introduce you to somebody very dear to myself and follow their lifelong journey of education. And you can see how this traditional form of education was so beautiful, was damaged, and yet now still remains to this day something very relevant and something that we all can learn from. So this is my late father. His name is Tabasanakwit. It means low-flying cloud. And he got that name because when he was born on his father's trapline, his dad, the original Wabanakut, went down to the lake and saw a mist cascading across the shimmering waters of Lake of the Woods. And so as a boy, he was the last generation in our nation to grow up free. He was born on his father's trapline. He grew up in a village on an island in the middle of the lake where they had a medicine lodge as the center of the camp. And his family and the people in that community had not yet been forced to live on a reservation, or a reserve, as we call them in this country. And so he was the last of our nation who lived truly free. And he was brought into the Anishinaabe way of life in that kind of traditional instruction that I just described. And then something very interesting happened when he was a young boy. And to me, it is one of the things about indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing that I find truly remarkable. So he was taken from his parents when he was about 4 years old, and he was taken to this spot on Lake of the Woods. This is the mouth of a cave, and he was left there for 4 days as a little boy to go on a vision quest, to fast, no food, no water, and to seek his dream. And this is a photo of my son at the same spot, offering tobacco. And what I like about this aspect of many indigenous traditions is that it tells you that you can only go so far in hearing the stories of the elders. You can only go so far being an Oshkabewis or an Oskapewis, in apprenticing under the older generation. At a certain point in your life, you have to head out onto your own and accumulate new knowledge for yourself, and have to earn that knowledge by being out on the land, or by being on a journey, or by sacrificing some part of your well-being. And so we have many different traditions and many different descriptions for this. Some people, it's the vision quest. For other people, it's the berry fast. For others, it's a coming-of-age ceremony. For others, it's coming into the circle ceremony. And for still others, it's the Sundance. And yet across many of our indigenous nations, we have this rite in which you go out onto the land and you receive your life's calling through sacrifice, through prayer, and through humility. And nowadays, we might call that experiential learning. But there's something more profound and something more spiritual at work in these kind of ceremonies. The next big educational intervention in my father's life was dramatically different. This photo was taken of him and his grandson at the site of St. Mary's Residential School, just outside Kenora. And so when he was a little boy, my father was taken away from his parents and brought to residential school. And he was told that, no, your name is not Tabasanequit. Your name is Peter Kelly. Your parents are heathens, and you are a Maudit Sauvage. His hair was cut, and he was given the number 54. He was given a number. And he was told, when we say the number 54, you are going to jump and stand at attention. Over the next number of years that he spent in the residential school, he was beaten. He was raped by a nun. He was sexually abused. And perhaps most emblematic of what the residential school era was all about, he was likely subjected to nutritional experiments which were conducted by government-funded scientists. And we just learned about this just over a year and a half ago because of the research of Dr. Ian Mosby, then at Guelph University. And so you think about that, like these experiments, particularly around riboflavin additives to food, were conducted in the residential school where he and his brothers were at the time, in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So you think about what that says about the thinking that went on in this country at that time. So you had government-funded scientists fanning out to residential schools across the country. And everywhere they arrive, they see hundreds and hundreds of starving children. Literally starving because there's not enough food, not enough money for food to feed them. And so they come in and then they see these starving children and they don't think, hey, let's feed these kids. They think, hey, let's design a controlled experiment to run on these children. That's the kind of thinking that characterized the residential school era. That happened within this country, within living memory. This country is changing. I was in Edmonton for the final event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was made an honorary witness of the TRC that day, and I was very moved to see thousands of non-Native people in the audience. This country has changed, but we cannot forget where we've been in the very recent past. Running experiments on children, starvation, assigning numbers to people. Who does that sound like? That's Canada in the very recent past, within living memory. Okay? And I know there's an attempt nowadays, because we've had the apology and we've had compensation and there has been the TRC to try and offer up a revisionist history of residential schools, right? And so I hear people say things in public like, well, Wob, if you ignore the pedophilia, which is like a crazy thing to say on its own, right? But setting aside the abuses that happened, I think by and large we can recognize that this is about the best interests of First Nations children. Huh? No. The expressed intent of residential schools was to kill the Indian and the child. Okay? The architects of this system, from Sir John A. Macdonald to Duncan Campbell Scott, they weren't trying to better Indigenous communities. They were trying to clear us out of the way to facilitate the process of Western settlement. Right? And that's disturbing if you think about it, because what it means is that some part of our prosperity right now, of the well-being of myself and all of you in the audience today, is based in part on the past suffering of Native children. It's disturbing. And so if we recognize that truth, then I'm not asking anyone in this room to atone for the sins of the father. But I am asking for you, based on that understanding and that insight, to be part of some of the solutions today. And I think that we ought to be driven to compassion, to empathy, and to a little bit more of understanding of why things are in this country still light years different for many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. Right? So when people say it was about the best interests of Native children, when you talk about kill the Indian and save the child, when you talk about opening up the West for settlement, I don't hear any calculation of the best interests of Native children in that rhetoric, right? So let's be honest, let's be truthful. It's a process of truth and reconciliation. Or as I like to put it, no truth, no reconciliation. This is a mandatory government policy. Every child was to be taken away from their parents for more than 100 years. This book, I think, gives a little bit of insight into how damaging that could be, right? Like this author, Paul Tuff, he's a journalist, but basically he just surveys the literature and tries to find an explanation for how is it that some kids can go through a very stressful upbringing and yet remain resilient, whereas other children in the same environment never manage to overcome and adopt self-destructive tendencies. And essentially what he says is, it has real physiological impacts. Stress in your life creates stress hormones in your body, and that can lead to things like hypertension later on in life, right? And so not only do you get the learned behaviors, but you also get very real physiological changes as a result of being put in a high-stress environment as a child. But what he also finds in the literature is that you can make an intervention into the lives of children to make a difference. And the intervention is pretty simple. It's TLC. If a kid is going through a stressful time, if they have their mom or dad there to rub their shoulder, pat their head, tell them it's going to be okay, the kid develops resiliency. And they also find that a parent, if they're not there, then another adult can fill that role. Mentor, counselor, teacher, something like that. So now reflect back on the residential school era. Not only were kids put into an extraordinarily high-stress environment, like even if they weren't abused, they were still taken away from the family, still taken away from the languages that they spoke, right? Still brought into an alien environment. Not only were they tossed into this high-stress environment, but they also had removed from them the one thing which could have helped them cope: their parents, their families, their supports, right? So extraordinarily damaging. This other book, I think, gives some insight into how that can play out over time. It's The Power of Habit. I'll save you guys the $20. Here's the thesis of the book. I guess I owe this guy royalties now. We're creatures of habit. And we develop habits through this feedback loop of cue, routine, reward. Cue, routine, reward. We do something the first time, it's a novel behavior. But we repeat that over and over and over again over years and years and years, it becomes a habit, right? And because to use a metaphor, like what's happening in your brain is that neural pathways are being carved out. And this is such a base level activity in our minds that even if we suffer brain damage where we lose the ability to retain short-term memory, we still retain the ability to cultivate new habits, right? Habits are formed through this feedback loop. It's not because we remember things. It's not conscious, right? It's more of like a subconscious level type things. So think again about communities that had the children taken away. Think about generations and generations of kids in the indigenous community who didn't have the benefit of parenting, right? Now you start to understand, why things seem to be so intractable and so difficult to reconcile. Because these issues, these learned behaviors, these self-destructive tendencies, they were not learned over a day or a week or a month. They were learned over years, right? And they were learned over generations, right? I spoke to this woman at the Edmonton TRC, and she said, you know what, my great-grandparents went to residential school, my grandparents went to residential school, my parents went to residential school, I went to residential school, and now I'm raising my kids. I'm the first generation in my family within living memory to raise my own children. She's very proud, as she should be, right? But you think about a community that's been impacted like that as a result of government and church intervention, right? And yet we're like, oh, why is there a graduation gap? Why don't Indigenous people just lift themselves up from their bootstraps? Like, why? Right? Whatever, right? These things are generational issues. They were caused over a long period of time. So how is it that we expect that, like, after 140 years of moving in one direction, that, like, 5-10 years moving in the other direction, things are going to be hunky-dory, right? It seems kind of counterintuitive to think that way. But now things are different. The country has changed somewhat, right? Because, one of the other rationales for the residential school era was, we need a lot of laborers to extract the natural resource wealth of this country. Why don't we find them in the indigenous community, right? So they said 140 years ago. Globe and Mail runs editorials like that today, right? So in some ways, the rhetoric hasn't changed. But at the same time that the country has obviously moved forward in some important respects, the indigenous community is currently going through a resurgence, right? There are still challenges. Income is lower, life expectancy is shorter, prevalence of diabetes and certain forms of cancer are higher, incarceration rates are bigger. If you guys saw that Maclean's article about Winnipeg, right, the most fascinating part of that issue isn't the article. There's an infographic later on in the issue which compares the gap between the standards of living between Aboriginal people and the rest of Canada with the gap between African Americans and the rest of the United States. And the gap is more pronounced in Canada, right? So challenges remain for sure. But at the same time, there's also resurgence happening. Indigenous people are starting businesses at a rate 2.5 times faster than the mainstream. An Indigenous woman with the same level of education as an Indigenous man will earn more money after graduation. So the gender pay gap is reversed in our community, right? Education gap still exists, but it's closing. Right? There's about 27,000 Indigenous people in post-secondary institutions right now, right? More than there's ever been. Languages are returning. It was said that 3 years ago, or a number of years ago, that there'd only be 3 Indigenous languages to survive the next 100 years. But because of the work in 6 nations, we're seeing other languages like Mohawk and Cayuga start to bounce back, right? And I'm sure that Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota will also be with us into the foreseeable future, right? Culturally, what's going on in this country? Who was the most important artist in this country last year, according to the newspaper of record? Tanya Tagak, right? Who is making the most exciting music in this country right now? A Tribe Called Red. Yeah. Who is the greatest author in this country of our generation? Joseph Boyden. Not me yet. Just kidding. Yeah, right. No, it's Joseph Boyden. Right? So that's one of the beautiful things about many of the young people that you teach, is that they're not encumbered by the attitudes of the past. Right? Like when I talk to young people today, like they don't necessarily leap to the stereotypes that we older generations have, right? Like for them, a First Nations person is a Stanley Cup winner like Jordan Nolan, right? It's an author like Joseph Boyden, you know? It's a Polaris Prize winner like Tagak, right? And so there's something really beautiful and something really remarkable about that. And we have to try hard to preserve that and make sure that young people can still retain that positive outlook, even as they remain committed to fighting the social injustices which still permeate our society. And so you have scenes like this one. This is my wife. She's a medical doctor, but she's also chilling fireside at a Sundance. That is a scene, a snapshot from the Indigenous resurgence today. Successful, educated, strongly committed to our community and to our culture. And here's another one. This is my little sister, Shawnee Benasik, Kiwetna Shik, Kinew. Another good Ojibwe name for you guys to learn. And this is the day before she got her master's degree at Harvard University, right? And she's writing her PhD dissertation right now. So in about a year, she'll have the highest academic degree from the best university in the world, right? Do you know how much money the federal government has paid towards her education so far? Yeah. And it's not because those programs don't exist, it's because she's there on full academic scholarship, right? So when she graduated from the University of Toronto, there was a bidding war between Columbia and Harvard for her to attend their universities, right? So it's not out of line to say that she's among the brightest in her field at her age in the whole world, right? And she is a native kid from the bush in northwestern Ontario, right? And it's remarkable. So I was there at Harvard, I was watching her graduate and, you know, getting all choked up in that, right? Because I watched her do it. I watched her go from the little house on the reserve to the apartment in the city and then the house and then off on her own. And then now she's like killing it on the global society. Thanks, it was a lot of hard work and, you know. No, obviously I had nothing to do with it. It's all her. But this is what you're losing out on, Canada. Why is she going to come back here and be called a squaw? Why is she going to come back here and see the kids that she grew up with killing themselves? Why is she going to come back to this country and be told that she's less than? She's the best in the world. She's out in the global centers of power. Rome, New York City, Cambridge. Why is she going to come back here and deal with the legacy of colonialism and racism in this country, right? So First Nations people, Inuit people, Métis people, we know we've been done wrong. We understand that we have borne the brunt of colonization. We know that all too well. But Canada, people from other walks of life, you need to understand that you have also suffered as a result of colonization. You are also worse off because of colonization and the racism and injustices of the past, right? Because the best, brightest young Indigenous people today are not going to tolerate it and are not going to stick around for it, and you are worse off for that. And so now ask yourself, how many other people like that have you missed out on having contribute to your society over the past 140 years, over the past 150 years, right? That is the injustice of colonization. Not only that Indigenous people were held down, but that our entire global society was deprived of the wealth of contributions that could have been made by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So, do we want to continue on that path? Do we want to continue and use bureaucracy and funding pressures and all these other excuses that we use to postpone justice for Indigenous people? To push that day of equality further into the future? Or are we going to stand up now and say, enough? We want to live in a country where First Nations, Métis, and Inuit kids all have an equal shot at success, and we want to be able to retain the best and the brightest minds here at home. Simple. Right? But like every time we want to have that conversation, we get sidetracked. Like last year, guess what, Canada? How about we start giving kids born on a reserve the same level of education, same level of funding for their education as everyone else in the country, right? Because right now their schools get $4,000 less per student per year, and that's more pronounced when you get to the remote communities. So that if you go to northwestern Ontario, the gap per full-time equivalent is about $17,000 per year, right? So last year, we had a chance to have that conversation and to fix that inequity, right? And here's how the conversation goes. Hey, let's live up to what the Charter says. Let's live up to having equal services no matter where you live in this country. Let's fulfill the vision and promise of Canada. Yeah, but you know what? The Chiefs kind of, you know, they steal money. Huh? That's what happens, right? We allow ourselves to be sidetracked and to postpone justice, right? What happened in the second half of last year? Tina Fontaine is murdered. Canada finally wakes up to the fact that there's, you know, this epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. That if you're a First Nations, Métis, or Inuit woman, you're 4 times more likely to be murdered than another woman in this country, right? So again, can we make this country safer for Indigenous women and girls? Yeah, well, it's, you know, Native men need to do it. Like, why do we always get sidetracked when it comes to dealing with these things? And I'd argue because there's still an empathy gap, right? Real easy to wear a Tribe Called Red shirt. Much more difficult to talk about political and economic justice for First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit people, right? And so we're at this time of transition in our country. Anyway, by the way, while it is true that most Indigenous women who are murdered do know the perpetrator, here's the thing that reveals to you that the politicians have not read the reports that they point to and have not read the work that the RCMP did. While it's true that most victims knew the perpetrator, Indigenous women are actually less likely than non-Indigenous women to be murdered by their husbands. Right? I'm not saying there's not an issue with domestic violence. I'm not saying there's not an issue with gender equality. Absolutely there is. But the situation is much more convoluted and nuanced than you would appreciate at first glance. So inspired by all that, I went back to school too. A little bit less well-known than Harvard. But it's all right. So I work at the University of Winnipeg. I'm part of the senior executive group there. We got a lot of cool programs that are designed to kind of level the playing field, right? So, you know, government is not rushing out to level the playing field, so maybe we, as a university, as an educational institution, can step up and help fulfill the treaty promise around education. Maybe it's not just up to the Crown to be a treaty partner. Maybe it's up to everyone in this country to be a treaty partner and help fulfill the vision that opened up these lands, right? And so one of the programs that we're offering right now is something that we're developing for the corporate sector. It's called Indigenous Insights. And what this is like Indigenous history, culture, contemporary issues 101 for those who are doing consultation work or who are reaching out and want to have inclusion programs and employment equity and stuff like that. And so, you know, we profile like people that you see here like John Borrows, Tribe Called Red, Jamie Wilson, the Treaty Commissioner of Manitoba, Tayage Alfred, Shannon Kustachin, Idle No More, Murray Sinclair, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what I like about this is that we're doing the work of inclusion and equity. You know, we're teaching people what they should know. But we're also delivering it in a very innovative way. Like when you guys do online courses, like how much fun are those usually? Right? It's usually like some jerk like me giving a lecture on video, or it's like a PowerPoint with like a voiceover, right? Or it's like some weird thing with like an animation that's timed at the bottom, and you have to wait for the timer to run out before you can click through to the next section, right? All right, you have fun with that. That's what our online training program looks like, right? It looks like something that you produce for television, right? Or it looks like something that you might watch of your own volition on YouTube. And what I like about that is that we're innovating, right? We're doing something very different in the online space, something very innovative, right? And what I like about that is that it's my philosophy, right? Like, I'm not concerned with equality and justice. You know what I mean? Like, those things are good, but that's not really my goal. I'm not trying to catch up with everybody, okay? I'm trying to leapfrog, and I want to lead, right? That's my vision for Indigenous peoples in this country, is for us to fulfill the leadership role that we always should have been having in these lands. And so a project like this is cool, because it's not just us going like, well, hey, what's Harvard and MIT doing, and we'll just copy that. No, it's like us asking, what is the best thing that we could imagine doing, and let's do that. There's a program called Young Entrepreneurs, and this is a after-school business program for high school students. And the idea is develop a business plan, pitch it to investors, sort of like a Dragon's Den style thing. But along the way, the students learn about Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous culture. And so they're taught, for instance, at a sweat lodge about making tobacco ties and about offerings and stuff like that. And they hear how, in a traditional worldview, if you take something off the land, you should give something back. An offering of tobacco, maybe some cloth. If you drop a moose or a bear, you should fix the body in a certain way and honor the spirit of that animal, right? And then they come back into the business world and ask, what would that mean for a timber company if they had to put down tobacco each time they cut down a tree? What would happen to a mining operation if they had to leave an offering for everything that they took out of the earth? And so it becomes this interesting teaching opportunity where we can explore Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous cultures, and all that, but at the same time show the parallels to contemporary management theory. Things like triple bottom line accounting, things like trying to internalize the externalities of industry, so on and so forth. So that's been really fun for us to deliver. And a number of the people you see in the photo there are now University of Winnipeg students, right? And so it's also a pathway towards post-secondary. The winner gets to go to Vegas for the Reservation Economic Summit, which is like the premier business forum in Native America. And trying to see if there's a laser pointer on here. Anyway, the young man who's in front of the Bellagio there with the black jacket and the red shirt, his name's Kelly Edwards. He pitched this amazing business plan. Like, he had financial projections which were very detailed and realistic, going out 7 years, right? He went to IKEA. Like, his idea was a boutique hotel on an urban reserve in Winnipeg. And he went to IKEA and shopped for the furniture, and then he even did 3D renderings of what the hotel would look like and what the rooms would look like, right? And so the bonus for us is that we get to send him out to do media, and help break down some of the stereotypes about Indigenous people. Because, like, in Winnipeg, for instance, the idea of an urban reserve is still kind of contentious, right? And nobody really says this in public, but the reason it's still contentious is because people are afraid of what an urban reserve is. Like, they think an urban reserve might be like a car on cinder blocks, right? And then like stray dogs like running around and stuff like that, right? Like, no one says that in polite company, but really that's what they're thinking, right? But instead, we get to send this guy around to do media and say, no, that's not what an urban reserve is. An urban reserve is an economic development zone, and it means having young, bright, ambitious Indigenous people like Kelly as your neighbor, right? So that's a little fringe benefit. Anishinaabe Monatawatanig Abanonchiuk is another great Ojibwe name for you guys to learn and try to practice. We use this thing called the double vowel system, right? So you see, like, the words get like super long, super quick. And it's kind of like, it's a language, like many Algonquin languages like Blackfoot and Cree, Nehiyaw, that build sentences just out of making words longer with suffixes and prefixes, right? So the one super long word rather than having a sentence like you would in English of many different words. So that's why our words get crazy long like that. But this class, after school, Ojibwe language and culture program, trying to teach kids the language, but we do it using predominantly activities that are based in science, technology, engineering, math. So the kids there are building rockets, and the rockets are fun. It's like a toilet paper tube with a film canister inside of it, and then you put Diet Coke and Mentos into the film canister, and then it gets propelled. It's kind of hard because, like, where do you find a film canister nowadays? And then on the right, they're extracting DNA from strawberries, right, using cell lysis. And then so they learn the vocabulary in Anishinaabe. So cell lysis, tapshkopakweshaman. It's describing cutting the cell wall open, right? And they hear teachings in the language. They get excited about learning in a university environment. And so we're able to do like 3 different levels of learning there. We're 3 different levels, I guess, of pedagogy, right? Like we're able to teach language and culture, which is super important. We offer this program in Cree too, by the way. We're able to teach the STEM topics, right? Science, tech, engineering, math. And then on the tertiary level, we're also normalizing the university environment, right? Like in a family like mine, it's the expectation you're going to go to university, right? That's like the bare minimum. But for many of the kids we work with, because we're in the inner city of Winnipeg, they don't have anyone necessarily in their family or in their world that has gone to higher learning, right? And so to bring them into the university, put them into a chemistry lab, put them into a library, put them into an anthropology department, you know, it's important for them so that they can see that they belong in a place like that, they can have fun in a place like that, and that, you know, it's the same sort of intellectual pursuit that their ancestors have been engaged with for many years, right? And we're even kind of like breaking down barriers for some of the adults and some of the parents, right? Because they're like, well, what? There's words for like mathematical operations in Ojibwe. There's words for biological processes in Ojibwe, chemical processes. And it's like, yeah. Like, you know, that's one of the unfortunate things about what's happened in the, you know, the process of colonization is that we've been told a lie, right? We've been told this lie that we're not intellectual peoples. We've been told this lie that civilization and thought was introduced to us when the Europeans came, right? Which is not true, right? There's been astronomy and math and science in the Americas, you know, for millennia. But the unfortunate thing is that many of our people have started to believe that lie, right? And so we have to do stuff like that to roll that back and push that back. And so what we're discovering in delivering these programs is something that any grandma would have told you long ago. Culture and language matter, right? And now there's empirical research which is starting to underline that. You know, Chandler and Lalonde in BC, they found that in British Columbia First Nations that have self-determination, language, and culture, they do not have suicide. It's a pretty remarkable finding, right? If a community controls its own destiny, speaks its ancestral tongue, and practices its culture, the children survive. Researchers at University of Lethbridge and also Arizona State University have independently published research that shows that urban indigenous people engaged with culture and language are less likely to have substance abuse problems, less likely to have issues with drugs and alcohol. There's even a study published recently that found a correlation between language retention in communities, an inverse correlation between language retention and prevalence of type 2 diabetes, right? And it's not that speaking your language prevents diabetes, right? It's not a causal relationship. Rather, it's more likely that they're both symptoms of the same underlying illness, right? Which is colonization, right? And so they're both different sorts of indicators on the well-being of a community. So culture and language matter. And I think that we all understand why culture and language matter to Indigenous people, right? To Indigenous kids. It's about self-esteem and self-worth and identity and all those good things. I don't think that that's a tough argument to make, right? To me, the more interesting argument is that teaching Indigenous language and culture makes sense for non-Indigenous kids as well, right? And there's sort of two main arguments that I'll make around that. The one looks backwards, right? Like it or not, this country has an Indigenous identity, right? Go across these lands. Where do we live? Well, we live in places with names like Quebec, Tiggeronto, Ontario, Manitoba, Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, Snuneymuxw, Kamloops. Even the country itself has an Indian name. Canada. It's a Haudenosaunee word, right? And yet all we want to do is put a powwow dancer on our tourist brochures, but not really honor our Indigenous ancestry and Indigenous heritage, right? So how is it that we can claim to be Canadians if we don't know what the word Canada means, right? Or what it is, the culture that it comes from, right? And you get more into the myth of this country, right? Like the fact that like some jerk like Conrad Black can publish a history of these lands that's entirely Viking and British is ridiculous, right? The fact that a publishing house would even release that shows that we still have work to do in this country. Because like, let's examine the real history of this country. Yeah, the Vikings came, and then they were politely escorted out. So history picks up, really, history, in quotation marks, with the French explorers coming here and being cured of their illnesses by Mi'kmaq and Haudenosaunee and Algonquin people, and then being taught how to survive in these lands by those Indigenous people. And then in the period leading up to Confederation, we were the military allies who said, sorry, United States of America, you guys stay down here, right? Like without Tecumseh in Pontiac, we would all be pledging allegiance to the American flag up here, right? So we were the military allies who helped this part of the world from being taken over by America. Following Confederation, we were there at the treaty-making process, opening up the West for settlement. Following the turn of the century, we were there fighting in the world wars in higher numbers and decorated in higher numbers than anyone else, right? And by the way, like, have you guys gone and seen American Sniper? Not super popular in the teacher crowd, eh? Because everybody at the MMA gym has seen it. No, I was kidding. But it's about this Navy SEAL, Chris Kyle, right? And you could debate the merits of the movie, but at the end of the day, like the biggest movie this year so far is about this American guy with 160 kills as a sniper. Francis Pega-Magabo from Wasauksing First Nation in World War I had more than 300 kills as a sniper. Where's the Pega-Magabo movie? I want to see First Nation sniper. And it's not because I love war. Like, I don't want you to be like, oh yeah, he was good till he got on that whole military thing. Like, forget that guy. No, it's not that, right? It's just like, again, it shows the achievements of Indigenous peoples kind of being swept under the rug and forgotten. Like Super Bowl, right? Like everyone talked about Seahawks. Like, why didn't you run it? Like Marshawn Lynch, come on, right? Right? And you think about that, right? It's like the most American thing of all. Who invented the forward pass? Right? Carlisle Indian School football team. Right? How many American football fans know that? How many of them know about Jim Thorpe? How many of them who play in Pop Warner football know that Pop Warner was actually a coach of Indian kids at a residential school, a boarding school, right? So we have this tough history of ignoring the contributions of Indigenous people. Then following the world wars, we came back and helped launch the civil rights movement in this country, fighting for our own rights, our rights to leave the reserve, our rights to eat in the same restaurants as everyone else, our right to vote, along with helping to fight for the rights of women, African Canadians, and other people in this country. Following that, we were there for the repatriation of the Constitution. See Section 25 and Section 35. And then today, we're still in all aspects of society. Business, health, arts, teaching, sports, right? So I think we can do a better job of acknowledging that history and of showing what that's all about. So culture and language matter. Sorry, that was the look to the past, why we ought to teach Indigenous culture to non-Indigenous kids. Because whether we have Indigenous blood or not, it is part of our shared heritage as Canadians. And then the second argument that I'd make is more forward-looking, right? So think about where we're headed as a country, as a global economy. We're heading into a knowledge economy, and the most prized trait in a knowledge economy is innovation, right? The companies that create value are the ones that innovate, right? Google, Apple, right? The companies that don't are the ones that die, right? Or the ones that stagnate. Xerox, Microsoft. Sorry to any IT people in the room. But if we want to cultivate innovation amongst our students, if we want young people to think different, to think outside of the box, why do we all teach them to think the same way? Why do we teach them that there's only one way of looking at the world? Right? Why wouldn't we instead teach them, yeah, okay, here's one way, here's another, you know? And I think that Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous paradigms are an important way of introducing young people to another way of conceiving of the problems around them and also of coming up with the solutions. Because you think of what are the big problems in our world today? Income inequality, environment, terrorism, right? I'd say those are probably the top three. All right. We're having a tough time solving those with the Western, positivist mindset, post-positivist mindset, right? What would Indigenous culture have to say about those things? Terrorism. Well, what Tatanka Iotanke said, Sitting Bull, is that in order for there to be peace, it's not necessary for eagles to be crows. Right? And that's what I love about Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, is that they're able to capture things so succinctly and efficiently in few words. Because what's he saying? It's not necessary for eagles to be crows. He's saying that in order for us to live together, in order for there to be peace between different peoples, we don't have to be exactly alike. We don't have to have the same thoughts, religion, worldview. All that's necessary is that we understand that we're both human beings, we both have merit, and we both deserve to live. Right? Not necessary for eagles to be crows. That kind of wisdom would probably go a long way in this project of reconciliation here in Canada. But how cool would it be if Vladimir Putin recognized that it's not necessary for eagles to be crows? Or if Israelis and Palestinians recognize that it's not necessary for eagles to be crows, right? Or if the sectarian conflicts in a place like Syria and Iraq, if both sides could understand that, well, you can be Sunni and you can be Shia and you can still live together, right? That kind of wisdom could be applicable globally. The environment. Okay, how can you destroy the environment if you see the earth as your mother and the water as her lifeblood? Right? How could you cultivate such a large excess of carbon in the atmosphere if you understood that any time you have an impact on your environment, you have to offset it in the same way? right? Income inequality. Well, you know what I was taught at the Sundance? And at the Sundance, they are intentionally trying to cultivate you as a leader. They are giving you the teachings to be a leader in your community. What they tell us is the chief should be the poorest one in the community. And they're not making like this Canadian taxpayer whatever lie that's been propagated in Canada, right? Because the median salary of a chief is like $60,000, right? They're not making a point like that. What they're saying is this: if you want to be a chief, if you want to be a leader, it's not about standing up at the podium, standing in the spotlight. It's not about having a big bank account. You want to be a leader, you want to be a chief, you are committing yourself to a life of service. You are committing yourself to a life in which you put the well-being of everyone else ahead of yours, right? So if there's a kid that's hungry in your community and you're chief, you should give them your food. If there's a woman that is cold, you should give them your jacket. If there is a person who is suffering and hurting, you should use your pipe, your drum, your songs, your medicine to make them feel better, right? And that's the worldview of an Indigenous person. So if you grew up in a culture that taught you that the chief should be the poorest one in the community, then when you became a chief executive or a chief operating officer or a chief financial officer, would it be possible for you to cultivate like this ridiculous disparity between the top 1% and the bottom 99% in this world? Probably not. It would probably offend your sense of ethics and justice, right? So this is what I mean by we all lose out when Indigenous knowledge is not allowed to contribute to the mainstream. Because I think that some part of the solution to the current problems we face in this world can be offered up from Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous ways of knowing, right? And so again, I'm not trying to catch up. For sure, every kid in this country deserves equal shot at education, equal shot at healthcare, and equal shot at opportunity. But I'm not going to be like, oh, great job for doing the right thing, which is the bare minimum, right? Like, that's not the part that I find really exciting. The part is, once we get to that expectation of equality, how can we then leverage that into unleashing the strengths of our cultures into the world? And so this is a teaching tool that might help you do so. I think that the best way to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous wisdom into the classroom is to work with Indigenous knowledge keepers and practitioners, right? And to design, the program with them in consultation and deliver it together. But like how many of you guys have the time to do that? The money to do that, right? So this is a good resource. It was developed by the Ontario High School Teachers Union. It's called Full Circle, and it's a DVD with 270 lesson plans ready to go, available online, that incorporate Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous wisdom into a variety of different subjects. So not just native languages and native studies, but also like social studies, phys ed, language arts. And so that's a really good resource because I think it cuts down on some of the prep time and some of the development time. Oh yeah. And this is sort of like an example of a company that's used Indigenous wisdom, right? Because if you're still like, okay, that's a nice theoretical exercise you came up with there, Wab. Where's some proof? Well, there's a few companies that have used Indigenous wisdom to good effect. But Facebook is probably my favorite example, right? So when Zuckerberg was scaling up Facebook, he based some of his thinking about it on the potlatch, right? So Facebook is actually like a global potlatch. It's like a global giveaway, right? And, anthropologists criticize our societies where we judge wealth by how much you give away rather than what you accumulate because they say that, that sort of gift economy, it can't work at a large scale because you'll have freeloaders and then you won't be able to figure out who's taking from the giveaway blanket without giving back once you get to a community of 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million, right? But Zuckerberg recognized that the internet changes that equation. Recognize that you can have, with the internet, you can have perfect information at a global scale, right? And so he says you can make a gift economy work at a global scale. And that's what we want to do, is we want to cultivate online that same sort of attitude, that the richest people in the Facebook potlatch are not those who accumulate, but those who give away. And those are the people who are prized the most. So what are the gifts that you give in this Facebook potlatch? Well, it's the shares, likes, status updates, videos, comments, right? Any interaction that you have with another person on Facebook is like a gift that you're giving to this gift economy. And the same way, in like a potlatch or in a giveaway society where there's social sanctions put on people who don't contribute, that exists in Facebook as well, right? So like if you go to a giveaway and then you go to another giveaway and then you go to another giveaway and you're always taking blankets, but you never hold a giveaway yourself, people are gonna put social sanctions on you. They're gonna be like, oh, that guy's really cheap. That guy's so tight. Oh, did you see that cheap giveaway he had? Didn't even have any jackets, right? People will do that, right? And then so you get shunned or, you get teased, and then, you figure like, oh, man, I got to do a better giveaway, right? Same thing on Facebook, right? What happens if you look at everyone's photos but you don't post any photos? Creep. Lurker, stalker, whatever. So this is an example, right? Like Facebook created a huge amount of wealth around the world, right? And some part of its innovation, right, was spurred on by indigenous knowledge, indigenous wisdom. So how many other examples are there like that out there? How many other potential, innovations in our forward-facing world could be driven if we were all exposed a little bit more to indigenous knowledge, indigenous cultures, indigenous languages? So I like that. So I'll close off the anecdote about the old man. So he went on and, he led a good life and became a good leader, Grand Chief, Regional Chief, and raised his kids, and I'm the underachiever in the family. Right? Like my sister's at Harvard, my other sister's a lawyer and a Grand Chief. My little youngest sister, right, she's not even at university yet, but she already speaks Mandarin, right? So watch out. Yeah, right? Because she's fully cognizant of where the world is going, right? And so she's preparing for that. So in spite of the challenges that he faced as a little boy, as a young person, he still managed to have a good life. And then he was there for the apology at the House of Commons and traveled to the Vatican to hear the Pope express his sorrow. And a lot of people criticize the Pope for not apologizing outright. A lot of people said, oh, why did he just express sorrow? Why didn't he say sorry? But my dad, he said, I wasn't sure either. I wasn't sure about the Pope either. But what I did is when we met him, I had an eagle feather and I offered it to him. The actions speak louder than words. I'm not too concerned with what he said. I'm concerned with how he's going to react when I give him the eagle feather. If I offer the eagle feather and he doesn't touch it, I know that his words are empty and that I came across the ocean for nothing. But instead, he offered the eagle feather, the Pope took it, and he held it, and he said a prayer. Right? So even the Vatican is changing, right? Like usually they're like 400 years late to the party, right? Like Galileo and Copernicus and all that stuff, right? It's like, yeah, I guess the Earth is revolving around the sun. But in this case, it's only like 50 years behind the times. So that was really good. And on that trip, he made friends with the Archbishop that you see there, now retired, the Archbishop of Manitoba, James Weisgerber. And they became friends, and then they cultivated this relationship. And my father started going to Mass, and started praying in the Catholic way alongside the traditional Anishinaabe way. Because our religion, you don't have to give up what you are, right? Like we don't say we're the one true faith and we're the only ones who know God. No, many paths to the same goal, right? And so you can come to the Sundance. I've seen people at the Sundance wearing Tibetan robes, right? Monks from Tibet. It's a beautiful thing. So he started going to Mass. But to his credit, the Archbishop also came to our Sundance. And I remember watching him over there, and he's sitting next to the Sundance chief, and there's these two old men, right? Like these two spiritual leaders of their people, sitting there in the Sundance skirt, the bare chest, the medallion of the sun around their necks, the eagle whistle, right? And my sister Diane, she leans in and she's like, isn't that a Kodak moment? I was like, yeah, that's too bad there's no cameras allowed at the Sundance, right? Because 100 years ago, it would have been his job to call the RCMP if he saw that ceremony going on, right? And instead now he's praying with us in our way, in our circle. So things changed. And so my dad adopted him as a brother in the Nabagonde Win ceremony. And our Lakota, Dakota relatives, Nakota relatives also have a similar ceremony, the Hunka ceremony, right? And it's a peacemaking ceremony, a reconciliation ceremony. We were at conflict then, but I'm taking you as my brother, as my sister, and now we're going to work it out. That's the intention behind it. So we embraced him. It was a remarkable, remarkable thing to see. You know, these residential school survivors who have every reason to be mad, every reason to be angry, instead greeting their former tormentors with love, with compassion, with understanding. You know, and that's a remarkable lesson, not just a lesson in how to be a good Indian, but also a lesson in how to be a good human being. And I really like that one. And so, 2012, canonization of Saint Catherine de Guita, we went to the Vatican again to watch this little girl lifted up to the heights of their religion, you know? And, you know, I respect the Catholicism, but I remain a Sundancer, and I remain a traditional person. But I wanted to go see history being made. So that's my mom and dad there at St. Peter's Square. And it was really cool to see him and Chief Willie Littlechild and Phil Fontaine and Carolyn Briere and all these people who went to residential school lived to see a day when a young Indigenous person like they were when they were in residential school was lifted up to the greatest heights of the religion that was at the center of some of their darkest days. You know, that was a real remarkable thing. And it made me pause and reflect on the experience that they lived, that the experience that the residential school survivors in our country had. You know? Like, it is remarkable what they did, what they accomplished in their lifetimes. Because you think about their journey, it started when they were this big. It started when they were just little people, right? And they had the combined weight of the biggest church in the world and the Canadian state and the 4 other big churches in this country leveled at them, trying to crush them, trying to destroy who they were. But they survived that, even though they were just small little people. And they survived that, and then they went out and they waited and made their lives. And they waited for this country to change, for you and I to change. They waited for the churches to change. And then finally they waited for the government to change and to come back and tell them sorry and tell them what they knew all along. We were wrong. You were always right. You always deserve to be who you are. And we're sorry. That is a remarkable journey, right? And to me, that's the greatest reason why we should be teaching residential schools today. Yes, we have to acknowledge the dark history. Yes, we want to make sure that that never happens again. But most importantly, this is the site of some of the greatest stories of triumph that have ever happened in our country. And we ought to never forget that. We ought to always celebrate that. So for me, it starts with teaching residential schools in K-12 and university. And, you know, full credit to Alberta for being a leader in implementing that with the announcement last year that that would be mandatory part of the curriculum at the TRC. Very good, very good. But I think we have to continue that. And it's my ambition within my lifetime that we have a national, statutory, federal holiday in honor of the residential school survivors to commemorate them and their legacy. So yeah, that was the journey of education. from the indigenous beginning to the residential school experience, to going on in life and raising children, to understand that education is no longer a tool of oppression, but rather today in indigenous communities, it's a tool of empowerment that we're using to raise ourselves up. And to an elderly time and an elderly existence where he could go back and teach the lessons of grace and humility and compassion to the emissaries of Christ, who were supposed to be showing that to him when he was a little boy. So that was a remarkable, remarkable journey that he went on. So in the end, he was there in a dark room, and we're sitting beside his bed, and the priest came to see him. And that's where you really see that we all get reduced to our basic level existence at the end, right? Like the things that we think so much about in life, they don't matter in the end. My dad was sick. I thought one day, like, oh man, maybe I should just like go get like $5,000 out of the bank and give it to him. Like it sounds so stupid, right? For me to say it like that. Money matters so little at the very end that it's a wonder we spend so much of our lives stressing over it. Steve Jobs, one of the richest people in the world, died of the same cancer that took my father, right? So when the Creator has your number, the Creator has your number. Doesn't matter how much money is in the bank. So money ceases to matter. Politics ceases to matter. Idle no more was rising up around the country. Didn't matter. It wasn't, okay, I'm only seeing liberals today. Please ask the conservatives and the NDP to wait in the hallway. Like, that would be ridiculous, right? So why do we let those things divide us so much? You know? And then you get down to what really matters. Food. But then you can't eat. Water. But then you can't drink. Air. But then there comes a time when you're not breathing anymore. You know? And there's a time there where all that is stripped away and you're still alive. And you exhaust the final, most precious resource that we all have. Time. And then your time is up and you're gone. And what's left then? Well, it's love. The love he had for us, the love we still have for him in our hearts, in our minds. You know? We're all heading for a common fate. We all share a humanity. And we ought to recognize that. So if we start to think in those terms, what's holding us back from doing the right thing? What prevents us from delivering justice to every First Nations, Métis, and Inuit child in this country? What's a few $1 billion between friends? So these are some of the questions that I think that we all ought to ask in the work that we do and in the mission that you all have, to not just teach people to be workers and employees, but also to teach people to be good citizens and good human beings. So with that, I'll say miigwech kapizindao. Thank you guys very much for listening to me. Watch this.